Hello and welcome to this week's myNewsWrap, news from the world of SAP, Microsoft and the world in between. Let's get started with the SAP side of the house. Here I have two blog posts that I would like to highlight. First one is by Carlos Rogan. It's the second part of a blog post series that I have referenced 2 weeks ago, which is about the SAP Event Mesh and the multi-tenant setup. So using the SAP Event Mesh with a Cloud Foundry app. This second part builds upon the first part, so it's really a successor of the first part, and it focuses on the area of bringing in user interface and all things around user authentication and security. As usual, super high quality blog post guiding you through the setup and all the bits and pieces that you have to bring together in order to make things work. Then another blog post that I would like to highlight by Mustafa Benson from the personal insights area of the SAP community. And this blog post is titled, "Is SAP Business Technology Platform ready for developing industry cloud software as a service applications?" And I think that's a very valuable read, very objective, very fair feedback. So if you are a partner, SAP partner, I think that's definitely something that is worth reading, because that's the state of the art when you want to publish solutions on the business technology platform. So that's not a frictionless process. Let's put it that way. And this blog post really highlights all the bits and pieces where there is some friction. So very fair feedback, highly appreciated, especially in the way that it's presented. So very objective. Now, with that, let's switch to the world of Microsoft, and of course, starting with Azure Functions. First of all, a blog post from the Twilio blog post site, where there is also a new member in the Twilio developer advocates area, namely Marius Overt, who was before a developer advocate at SAP. He's now one at Twilio, but this blog post is by a different writer about using Azure Functions and using the SendGrid, so the Twilio SendGrid, in order to send out emails, and combining that using the binding mechanism that is available with Azure Functions. And this blog post guides you through the setup on the Twilio side as well as on the Azure Functions side, using Azure Functions with .NET 6. So that's really a cool scenario, and I think one of the usual scenarios that you would use with Azure Functions. And then another blog post, also very interesting scenario, this time about Azure Functions with their durable extensions, so other durable functions using fan out, fan in pattern. So really distributing work upon parallel processes and syncing that when all the work is done. And that's really an interesting scenario because it's about speech to text. So the setup is basically you have some speech files, some WAV files stored within the Azure storage. And then you create durable functions and combine them with the Azure service for text-to-speech, and do the processing of several WAV files distributed upon the Azure Functions activities. So that's a really cool scenario. It's from my perspective, a perfect scenario for Azure Durable Functions, and also quite interesting what you can do with that when you bring in other services that are living on Azure or even from the outside. So that's really cool. And then another video that's also super interesting around durable functions, namely about changing storage providers. So this video dives a bit into the topic of Azure Durable Functions and the storage provider behind that, because the state of durable functions has to be stored somewhere, so there is no black magic. And usually that's Azure storage, or that was it for a long time. And over the last year, there came 2 new storage providers to the plate, mainly they're both still in preview, and one of them is Microsoft SQL Server, And this video by the ASP.NET monsters, that I don't know, but I'm not super active in the ASP.NET area, guides you through the usual storage and also the Microsoft SQL Server flavor of the storage. And then, wrapping up the serverless part, there is a new Azure Fun Bytes episode about Azure Static Web Apps with Anthony Chu. And it's talking mainly about Azure Static Web Apps. What are they? What are the key features? And of course, highlighting the new Enterprise Edge offerings for static web apps. And also the dives into the topic of auth providers and custom authentication. So that's really interesting. And of course, function support, but that's there right from the start. And in this area, there is also a blog post by Anthony that was published this week, I guess, due to that Azure Fun Bytes episode. And that's a really interesting one, because that's dealing with restricting Active Directory login to Azure Static Web Apps. Because usually you have some predefined authentication providers that you can use within Azure Static Web Apps. One of them is Azure Active Directory. There is GitHub, I think, Auth0, if I'm not mistaken, but don't take that for granted. Nevertheless, you simply use that. And then everybody who can authenticate with that has access to your Azure Static Web App. Now, within this blog post, Anthony shows how you can restrict the Active Directory login, making use of custom authentication that you usually only use if you don't have the authenticator provided out of the box with Azure Static Web Apps. And using this custom authentication, you can restrict the access to the Azure Static Web App to either a specific Azure Active Directory tenant or even to a specific user group or specific users in the tenant. And that's a really interesting scenario, a really interesting case how you can make that happen. With that, let's switch to the area of containers. First of all, starting with a blog post published on the White Duck blog post site about polyglot microservices. It's the third part of a blog post series around developing polyglot microservices. And this one highlights the usage of Dapper. So what is the benefit of using Dapper when developing polyglot microservices? Super interesting read from my perspective. Very deep dive into the topic. Talking about the available tooling, talking about other frameworks that are available in order to make those things happen, and also highlighting the downsides. Then talking about one discussion that always comes up with Dapper, so Service Mesh versus Dapper or Service Mesh and Dapper, and also talking about the limitations that Dapper has. So it's not that everything is unicorns and rainbows. So there are some limitations with Dapper that you have to be aware of if you want to use it, because otherwise you might very roughly hit a wall. Super cool blog post, really like that one. And with that, another contribution from the folks working at White Duck. Namely, this week's Cloud Native Rosenheim meetup took place, and there was a session about what's new with Kubernetes 1.23 by Philipp Belz and Nico Meisenzahl, who are both working at the White Duck GmbH. And that's a really cool session because it really goes through the Kubernetes 1.23 release and shows what's new, what's in alpha, what's deprecated. And also there are quite some demos in this session, so I really like that one. It's a cool session. If you think about upgrading to Kubernetes 1.23, I think that's also available on AKS now. You should definitely watch that session. And then this week, another video was published by Anais Ulrichs, who is doing 100 days of Kubernetes, so her public learning, super cool. So if you are not yet following Anais and are working in the Kubernetes area, then you know what you have to do. And this session is about Kubernetes RBAC, a full tutorial with examples. And that's great because that's something that I also had to wrap my head around a bit. And security is something my head is not easy to wrap around. And this video really helps a ton. So if you are also diving into that area, then definitely take a look at that one. And then, another announcement now more from the Microsoft area about AKS clusters. There is a private preview which enables persistent volume backup. So you can now back up your persistent volumes with your AKS clusters, which of course comes with quite some benefits if you have data corruption or delete persistent volumes. And with this feature, you can then also enable scenarios that would have not been that easily doable as it is now. So like having backup for persistent volumes if you have a stateful application deployed to AKS. That's, I think, one of the main use cases. And then last but not least, another nice video about Azure Arc by Gareth Backe, namely running Azure App Services anywhere with Azure Arc. So you have currently as a public preview the option to deploy Azure App Services into an Azure Arc managed Kubernetes cluster, which means you have total degree of freedom where you run your Azure App Services. And this video guides you through what you have to do and how things work out. So that's really cool. Then let's go to the area of DevOps. And first I would like to highlight a blog post by Thomas Thornton about deploying Azure container apps. So perfect segue from containers to DevOps using Azure DevOps and the Azure Container Registry. So really focusing on the Azure specific ecosystem using Azure repositories, Azure Pipeline, Azure Container Registry, and walking you through the flow that you have to put in place, that you have to configure in order to make that reality and have, at the end of the day, an app deployed to the Azure Container App Service, and also have the things connected to log analytics. So really looking at day 2 setups. That's really also a nice blog post. Then one GitHub repository that I would also like to bring to your attention, because we had the topic of landing zones last week, Azure landing zones, and there is a GitHub repository that gives you bicep templates for deploying Azure landing zones. So that's really super helpful if you want to set those things up and make use of bicep. Then some announcements around GitHub. There are 2 how to start or how to get started blog posts that came out this week. First one is focusing on workflows with GitHub Actions, and especially talking about how to use reusable workflows with GitHub Actions. Because as soon as you start, getting away from a monolithic setup and start modularizing, there are some challenges that you have to think about. And this blog post guides you through that. And there is also a very interesting section at the lower part, namely, first of all, of course, limitations that are currently there with reusable workflows, but there is also a little table that compares reusable workflows and composite actions. Because maybe you might think, I can also do some things with composite actions, and that's perfectly true. And there is a table that highlights the differences between the 2 styles in a very decent way. And then the second getting started blog post that I would like to highlight is about getting started with project planning on GitHub. There have been quite some announcements over the last weeks around the enhancements around the project planning that you can now do on GitHub and make that really the space to live and learn about projects. However, it's not super self-explanatory when you get started, so you are a bit overwhelmed from my perspective what's all possible there. And this blog post gives you a little bit of a quick start on getting started with project planning. And then some, announcements or news around GitHub. Basically, there is one new feature that is available for the GitHub app for Microsoft Teams and Slack. So if you have the GitHub app within Teams and Slack, there is now a discussion support. So you can now subscribe to the discussion feature from a Teams channel or a Slack channel within your GitHub app, and then you get notified when there is a discussion getting started or answered. So that brings things a bit more together if your way of work incorporates or focuses on Slack or Teams. And then there is also a nice, cool improvement that was pushed out this week, namely the developer experience for dependable alerts. There are two main things that have been improved. First of all, how dependable alerts are grouped. So they are no longer grouped by package, but they are now grouped or displayed as one alert per advisory and dependency manifest. So that makes it a bit easier to know what exactly is happening. And the second thing is there is an improvement in the alert lifecycle. So if you have fixed an alert, it will now be in the closed tab. So it will continue to appear there. Currently, that's not visible if you're using the GraphQL API in order to query things, but that will be available at the end of this month. At least that's announced. Yeah, with that, let's switch to the broader Microsoft topics that crossed my path this week. So first of all, a little blog post about how open source plays a key role in Microsoft's cloud strategy, especially focusing on Linux and Azure. So if this is something you would like to read a bit about, have some more information, then the blog post that I have referenced in the show notes is the perfect place for you. And then if you are a .NET C# developer, there is also a quite nice issue on the NuGet GitHub repository that is highlighting the release plans and the roadmap for NuGet in 2022. Of course, NuGet follows the scheduling and the roadmap of .NET, so it will be released always in sync with .NET 7 that will be coming out this year. And this issue highlights what will come, and of course gives you the option to provide feedback. Now, with that, let's switch into the Twilight Zone, the zone between SAP and Microsoft. And of course, as every week, there is a new edition of the SAP on Azure video podcast, this time focusing more on infrastructure topics, namely Azure NetApp files. So what are Azure NetApp files? How can you use them? What are they usable for when it comes to SAP HANA? What is the pricing? And so on and so forth. So if you are more on the SAP on Azure side of the house, then that's definitely worth watching. And then there was one cool announcement, great announcement by Martin Pankratz this week, who initiated a landing zone on how to get started with SAP and Microsoft. So there is a small blog post on the SAP community who introduces this topic. And there is, as the landing zone per se, now a GitHub repository that I have also referenced in the show notes with the wonderful name Ninja Unicorn, which serves as a perfect landing zone if you want to get started with SAP and Microsoft, especially with integration scenarios. So it's not that much focusing on infrastructure topics, and gives you a curated overview about the partnership, the technical foundation really from ground up, and then ending at the library of use cases, of joint use cases with SAP and Microsoft, giving you an overview where you can get your resources, namely an Azure trial, BTP trial, and so on. And then also highlights custom engagement initiatives and public betas. That's also something that's important. And from my perspective, super valuable. It also has a blog post gallery. There is a link also at the very top of the GitHub repository, which guides you to a blog post gallery, as the name says. So you have a gallery about blog posts. You have video channels where I'm happy to be part of that game. And you have a categorization and tags for the blog post. So you have different ways on how to find things and how to learn about things. And as you can see from the archives, Martin did really quite some work in order to go back in time until 2019, which is impressive. So if you want to get started then with SAP Microsoft, then that's the way to go. If you want to contribute, absolutely happy to get contributions within this repository. And at the lower part of the GitHub repository, there is also a short section on how you can contribute to this repository. So looking forward to more contributions from the community of SAP and Microsoft. Now, with that, let's switch to learning and events. And basically, it's about learning. First of all, a little Twitter thread that I've referenced within the show notes by Edidiong Asikpo, I hope I pronounced it correctly, about articles and learnings and tips about how to pass the Certified Kubernetes Application Developer exam, the CKAD exam. So it's a thread of 5 tweets that has some blog posts reference to that on this part on this exam. So if you are thinking about taking that exam, I think that's definitely a valuable starting point. And then one other article at the Fortune magazine that is not hidden behind a paywall, luckily. It's more about, let's say, food for the brain, something nice to read at the weekend. It's about how Microsoft Satya Nadella rejected a know-it-all mentality and earned the title of most underrated CEO. There is also a short video available on this site. And that's a really interesting article on showing how Satya thinks, how Satya sees and interprets leadership. So that's really interesting. I like the style of Satya a lot. And if you're also interested in that, I think that's a valuable article to take a look at. And then last section for today, developer experience. There is one blog post about how to configure your terminal on GitHub Codespaces. So probably you have configured your terminal on your machine as you want it with Omar Satchel or Omar Posh, or you made it your living room. And you can also do that with GitHub Codespaces. So this blog post guides you through how you can configure your terminal when you use GitHub Codespaces and then have the universal same look and feel of your shell all over the place. And then wrapping up today's session with a blog post from the README project area by GitHub, titled Brag Now, Remember Later, Document Your Accomplishments. This is a blog post, I think, at the right time of the year, right? When you have your annual discussions with your boss about the last year, the future year goals and so on. This is really interesting and highlights on how you should journalize or how you should document your accomplishments over the year and reflect about them. Really nice write-up. Interesting to read. Also highlighting about the aspect why you should reflect, how you should reflect, and how you can share that. And what I really like is that it also highlights the publicly sharing that via Polywork, because Polywork, I think, as a new business social network thingy is a perfect place for something like that, because it's designed around that. If you're not yet on Polywork, ping me. I can share some invites. I have some left, if I'm not completely mistaken. If you want to take a look at that one, because that's a really nice new way of having a network. So with that, I'm at the end of today's session, and I hope I had some news for you, some topics to think about, some topics to catch up with. And with that, I wish you a nice Saturday, a great Sunday, and a super successful next week. And see you next Saturday. Until then, bye.